All right, welcome to this overview of the RevBench software from Precision DynoTech for use with our Dyno data loggers. This will just be kind of as quick as I can, a quick overview of the software just to kind of show what it's capable of. As you can see, we do have an RPM signal and we do have a torque signal that we can simulate along with an AFR and an oil pressure signal. I just have a signal generator hooked up to generate this RPM signal and then some potentiometers hooked up to the data logger just for the purposes of recording this video. Anyways, we can get into the gauge config. You can configure these gauges to any input that you want. Right now, this big center gauge is set to RPM. If we want to set it to the corrected engine torque, we can absolutely do that. We can name this to anything we want. Let's say we just want it to be torque. And then, not with a slash, click Save. And you can see it's rounding the data right now with that checkbox. We can uncheck that and get our decimal point there. We can define the minimum max ranges of the gauge and then the tick intervals, these little tick marks all around the border of the gauge. We're going to set this back to RPM 1 just for the sake of this video. And then we'll move on. So the torque gauges, for any gauge that has torque as its input, you'll be able to right-click it and zero the load cell, so that's pretty convenient. Zeroing the load cell before a test is quite important. Just make sure your engine is off and there's no load on the brake. But load cells do drift over time, so just make sure that you do zero those load cells. And that's why we put it right here, just to make that easy. We have the option to open a live plot. So we can open the live plot from any one of these gauges by right-clicking them. In this case, we will look at the live plot of RPM over time. So you can see right here that this is showing RPM over time over the last, let's see, graph settings, 5 seconds. We can change the color if we like, change it to light blue, for instance. And we can do that for any one of these other gauges. For instance, I can open up a live plot for torque. And if I move that potentiometer, you can see that we are getting a torque value. Pretty cool. Continuing along with that live plot idea, we can open a live plot of power and torque over RPM. So here, once we open that window, you can see that we're plotting torque in red and power in blue over RPM. So that kind of gives us an insight into the actual live pools. So we can have this open while you're doing a test. So that's pretty neat to see that changing. In fact, if I move the torque potentiometer, you can see how that kind of moves. And if you want to clear the plot, you can simply click Clear. You might want to do that in case that your data length is more than 2 seconds. We can change this to 10 seconds. You can also change your range for the various axes. But we can click Apply to bring that to a 10-second data persistence here. So you can see how it's not really erasing it anymore. Once it hits about 10 seconds of data, it will start going away. But then you can click Clear Plot to get rid of that. I'm going to set this back to 2 seconds, though. After that, we've got environmental corrections down here. That's pretty self-explanatory. It will just automatically update your correction factors depending on what these environmental corrections are. Depending on which logger you have, it may or may not have the internal environmental sensors. It depends on which one you bought. The DC1 model does not. However, the DC2 and DC3 models that haven't been released quite yet on the website, they do have the internal environmental sensors. So it'll automatically populate these fields. You can override them, though. The software detects which device you have, so if it does have the environmental sensors, you'll have an option to override these values if you don't want the ones taken by the device. You can select your SE or STP or uncorrected just by clicking these buttons, and it will apply those for a test. So that brings us over to logging control. Enter your starting input, or sorry, your starting RPM and your ending RPM. And then once you are ready to do a test, you will simply just click ARM Test. So we can click ARM Test right now. And let me rotate the torque dial just to give us some test data. And here we go. So once the test completes, it automatically opens this window and we get our test results. It's pretty self-explanatory. We have our max values over here on the left and any correction factors that were used. We had none selected, And that's what it's telling us. However, if we wanted to look at, let's say, STP, we can do that. And it's simply taking the environmental data that was saved with the test, applying the correction factor, and then applying that onto the plot here. So don't worry if you forgot to select STP or SAE in your test. The important thing is if you input your environmental settings. So don't forget to do that. Other test details, you have the date, you have the time, and then down here you have data measures. So if we didn't want to look at the torque of the engine, we can unselect that and only see the horsepower. If we wanted to change the color of it, we can do that. Or we can select other data measures as well. So let's say we wanted to look at the oil PSI. So we can do that, and we can change the color, change that to green. So pretty self-explanatory. We can also look at these measures over time. Oh, and I kind of messed up the scale here. So if you ever need to rescale this, just go down here to the bottom left of this plot, click the A button, and it will auto scale everything. Anyways, measures over time. This test took about 4 seconds looking at this horizontal axis down here. So there could be certain reasons you want to do that. Mostly we're looking at measures versus RPM. Over on the right, you can enter test notes, name of the engine, any details about the engine, which carburetor you used, or which jetting, or which ECU map. Any of that information, enter over here and click Save Test. You can also filter the recorded data. So with this little slider right here, it filters the data. It will save this filter amount with the test when you click Save Test. So you can come back a week later, and if you didn't remember, if you used a filter amount of 13, don't worry, it was saved with the test. If you want to print it, you can. You can click Print, and it's going to print this plot, and it's going to put the max value information and the test notes directly on the plot itself when you actually send it to your printer. So it keeps things all nice and neat on your printout. So outside of that, we have our various configuration options. Analog input settings, this is where you select which analog inputs have which types of sensors on them. So you can see a few options here, pressure sensors or an AFR sensor or just the raw voltage. So you would set that depending on which analog input is used for those sensors. Load cell settings, we won't get too much into the details here, but this is how you calibrate your load cell. Inputting links to your torque arms, your calibration weights. You can also override the calibration if you know the specific calibration for that load cell if need be. RPM input settings, this is just defining what your RPM input settings are. So if you're using a tone wheel, you have 16 pulses per revolution. That's what that means. A filter window, so if your RPM signal is noisy, you can increase that filter window. Oh, 32 would be way too much. So you can increase that filter window. Generally, you don't want to go above 7. And then a sensor type. Right now it's on other, so we have a whole bunch of things we can define for a custom sensor. For the most part, you can just select Hall effect if you're using a Hall effect sensor, which would be common with the tone wheel. If you're picking up, from a points ignition, from the ground wire, from the coil, that's where you click points. We have infrared photosensors and inductive sensors. The inductive, this would be like a clamp on a spark plug wire. Anyways, yeah, if you had issues with those, we can go into the other page here, contact me, and I can kind of walk you through what values we can try if your sensor is giving you any problems. Then you have the virtual RPM settings. So virtual RPM is sort of another RPM channel, and it simply multiplies your source RPM by whatever value is in here. So that's pretty straightforward. If we wanted to see double the RPM, we would put 2 and click Apply Settings. That is going to affect some other settings depending on how the gearing of your engine is and which RPM you want to use for your power calculation. That won't be something we'll go to in this video, but the way you would set that is by clicking under Settings, Config, and your power input settings right here. Again, that's for anything that's geared, so the brake RPM does not equal the engine RPM would be when you would use those config settings. Lastly, we have the AFR input settings. So if you define an analog input sensor as being an AFR sensor, that's where it's going to use these voltage and AFR pairs. So this is sort of defining a curve, but 0 to 5 volts as an input for your sensor, and then an AFR value of 10 to about 20. And that's how we're defining an AFR sensor. However, these values are very specific to an AEM AFR sensor. So if you have a different sensor and these values are different, it's pretty easy. You simply just clear the data, and then enter your own values. And you just enter them as pairs. So say 3 to 13. This is simply just an example. And then it's going to calculate your AFR value dependent on these little value pairs right here. If you want to modify them, it's easy enough. You just select them, click modify. So that's about it. You can clear that data, or you can restore the defaults even. So pretty simple there. You can use that also as a custom sensor. It doesn't have to be an AFR sensor. That'll be a feature that's included in future versions. Other than that, that's about it for the RevBench software. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask in the comments or send me an email. Sean, that's SEAN, at PrecisionDynoTech.com. If you have any suggestions for improvements to the software, please let me know. If I don't know, I can't make the change. But so if you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. I will have more videos coming out pretty soon as far as more detailed information on how to configure certain things like specific RPM sensors or load cells, how to do the calibration routine. This video was just intended as a quick overview of the RevBench software. And with all that said, thanks for watching.